Hello.
The beginning of the recording part. We were just talking about. I was just trying to contextualize into my frame of understanding Veristruct, and in my mind, I was holding it in a place of, that it's associated with something of a more passive holding of something. I'm not trying to fully control and know that you are fully influencing every aspect of an ecosystem. For example, I would imagine a lawn is not very Veristruct. That's you're trying to control it to a very high degree, right? But you are open to
forest farming.
Yeah, and obviously,
foraging.
You'd probably be open to reshaping like old urban spaces back, But it gets to this interesting point where it's like sometimes like a physical space has been so far removed from what is considered like a local ecology that now it's like even the local ecology is adapted to that physical urban setting.
Yes.
Like pigeons aren't the same as they used to be.
No.
They have like knives now, They'll come you on the street.
They're gonna mug you now.
I don't know if people apparently used to eat pigeon all the time.
I've had pigeon. It's good.
I would imagine so. It's probably like quail or something.
It is similar to quail. I prefer quail, but pigeon's very good.
I remember I was like 14, and for some reason, like, I guess I was just like a posh little, but like for my birthday, I was like, I want to try quail. Like as if it was like a fancy pheasant thing. Like it was like, but I realized it's just another type of bird. So I want to understand that relationship between the feeling of justified action to shape a locality or shape something or just try to actively create a future, whereas just allowing a system to just be itself and just, because, my big thing is the cognitism thing, which on its surface is like this AI form of collective decision making, which sounds so far removed from the earth and the ground and, nature and like something that's connected with the physical. But in my mind, I definitely don't see it that way. And like my first album is very, very Veristructy.
Yeah.
Like just lyrically, and like the type of visuals that I tried to put in all of the music videos. Like I definitely made.
I love those, by the way.
Thank you. I made an intense effort to hide in the beginning that any of the work that I was doing was connected to technology too much, because that's not really where I saw like the root of where we needed to restructure. I saw it as a tool.
Yeah.
Like and it could be a useful tool, but like the foundation of it is community and interrelation and presence and observation and like listening to the space that you're embedded in. But that doesn't sound like, hey, let's go build some AI egregores that are, like, and then we're going to put it on the blockchain or whatever, like all that bullshit. Like it's a connected on both those ends. But I often find myself like in this weird middle space where it's like, because I'm both in this like regenerative space, but also coming from a technology angle, that neither ends seem to vibe with me too much. I feel like a monkey in the middle. Do you know Greg Landua's work with Regen Network?
No, I don't.
I mean, there's plenty of people who are trying to specifically quantify like the levels of pollution that we have impacted upon the planet, so that we can tangibly minimize them or tangibly alter them. Like this feeling like we can't really actively change systems that we have wreaked havoc on. Like I certainly don't want to go to like a big city that has like noxious smog everywhere and say, this doesn't need to be changed.
Right.
I mean, where you live in Arizona, right?
Yeah, so we live in Arizona. So it's a very old desert. The sand here has never really been met with any kind of water, consistent water source, so there's very few salts in it. So the plant life that exists here, some of it's really, really old and some of it's really, really new. So we have the Creosote plant, which is, they can live to be 13,000 years old. So they're very old. We were talking earlier about the redwoods, similar kind of scenario where you get these old ecologies that are just so fascinating. But yeah, you can still forage here though. That's the beautiful thing. And you can still stop weeding and stuff will grow up. And so the suburban tendency to weed and then to create a lawn, I don't think is a good.
What are your thoughts about foraging in relationship to the concept of the tragedy of the commons, which there is some debate about?
Mm-hmm. No, I like that.
Tendency, if yeah, because for example, like it's something that I'm like, yeah, we shouldn't take more of our fair share
Mm-hmm.
of like space, but like for example, my partner is vegan, but she really misses eggs, and there's a vegan egg made of mung bean at the store, and every time I go there, they only have like 6 in a box, and I just grab them all. I'm like, I don't care about the rest of the comments. I want to make my girlfriend happy.
Uh-huh.
That's what it comes down to. And like, hopefully, the store learns to provide more of that. But there is always, I think, in context, like a desire of individuals to take more than their fair share when doing something like foraging.
So I have a fun example. This is actually an answer to one of the questions that you gave. What is the Cognitist seed? And I came up with an answer that I think is quite real and might be a little confusing because it's so real. But that's of Kokidama. Do you know what Kokidama is?
Mm-mm.
So essentially, you take a plant or multiple plants, and you cover its roots in clay, and you create a ball. And then what often will happen is people will either, I forget what material it is, but they'll use various materials to cover it. I always like the idea of having living moss growing, so we tried it, and we've tried it several different times, and keeping it humid. So keep in mind, we tried this the first time in Ohio, so the humidity was much higher, and it needed to have a constant humidity that was pretty high to maintain it. And but yeah, we were able to keep the moss growing for a little bit of time. They're beautiful. They look like little worlds. We hung them from the ceiling so that they were just kind of floating next to our bed. It's very mesmerizing to look at. Sometimes you had to choose your plants carefully, the ones that went inside the ball, and you had to use some bonsai techniques of where you prune the roots and the top to get it to work, because otherwise the roots would start growing out and that would kill it. So you had to keep it at bay, have a particular humidity. The way that I think that this relates very well, and I have yet to come up with a system or a language to describe this perfectly. I really like the idea that there are sublinear growth and there is superlinear growth. That's a great example of whether you can tell whether something is following a natural growth pattern or an artificial growth pattern. But I don't necessarily know precisely. My best guess is gratitude. Gratitude is what separates the two.
Yeah, I had a big download earlier this year about gratitude that was quite intense. And it's it's yeah. Go on.
So I think gratitude is kind of the difference. But what we see with places like cities, population density, is there's definitely an artificial growth pattern at play. And it needs to be reinvigorated over and over again. You see this very clearly with the economy. You'll see a recession, a depression, and then it has to be injected with some adrenaline, for it to pick back up again. That is not a natural growth pattern. Natural growth pattern stays stable for a very long period of time, does not fluctuate that much. It's a very much more stable fluctuation, and eventually it just dies. You can't revive it.
For most living patterns, I know there are some functional species that technically can never die unless they're specifically killed by something, and they always maintain health, and they're very fascinating. And the function that is the termination is literally just the environment itself. Like something kills it, something smushes it, something stabs it, whatever.
Well, in that case, I would say they don't have a decision. So if you're able to make choices, you will die.
Okay,
so do you see all the connections there?
There's a lot there, and there's a core thing that I'm getting about like the fundamental way that we interrelate with the space that we live in is very important, which I both agree with, but I also understand that I can't dictate what is the best way to live with any particular space. I know that, I come from a psych background, and so there's a class I took called environmental psychology, which was really about like what makes human beings thrive and be very, very functional. And like we have deep innate triggers in relationship to things like trees and water, just like when you control for all the variables, human beings across all cultures are just happier near trees. There's some lingering element of, when we lived in trees, that just a little bit of boost, right? So there are things that I would say, okay, I truly believe that inner cities should have more trees, should have more vegetation, should be more alive and less rigid and less linear. But my angle is very much like I cannot speak for the needs of the people and where they live. And so what Cognitism is about is it's not an ideology, it's a tool for collecting people's perceptions about what they would like to see change in their physical space when they exist in relationship to others, because we're sharing a commons. That's the hardest part of anything. Like even just an apartment, like sharing a room with people and be like, I don't feel like you're doing your fair share, or sometimes people have different definitions of clean and what they want to see from their space, and coming into agreement.
Sounds like you know that personally. I think we've all been there, right?
Yeah. Yes. But in general, that's what it comes down to. Like all of our conflicts are that like we have hard time sharing space. So we created this idea of ownership that we back by violence. And that somehow, and like lines and walls, and that kind of precedes our own culture, because our cells have walls, right? That's a pretty common thing, as the barrier between like individual things. But like we also know that when we integrate larger structures from smaller parts into like a network, like there's this emergent thing that is magical. I mean, it made us. Like, we're fucking talking right now. Like, we are clusters of matter right now that are wiggling and making, reverberations, and then it reverberates like the tiny cellophane film, or however the mic on this computer works. It creates a tiny little signal, processes it into bits, puts it into this network. It comes out on the other end, and everything is reconstructed into an image in real time. And like, we can meet for the first time and have an incredibly interesting and deep conversation. that all comes from all of these emergence forming parts. And then we also see there's this new thing on top of all of that, which is the way that we interrelate with each other. And it's been happening over the last few thousand years, from like democracy to, or like start with tribal dynamics, just like sort of the natural relations that come
Sure.
from like who you could know, which is what a lot of people want to go back to right now. Like just be like, strip back everything else and just be like, we're just going to have a village and I'm only going to know 100, however many people. Which I can understand why that's tempting. But there's also all sorts of new forms. Like we've been scaling and scaling and scaling to this point where it's like now we have this big democratic structure and this big market structure, and we have all this, but it's like popsicle sticks. It's like we keep trying to grow by sticking popsicle sticks together. Like you said, you keep injecting money into it when it fails. You're like, oh no, the structure's about to fail. This big popsicle things can fail. Instead of being like, oh, maybe we need to let it crumble a bit to restructure, to make it more human. Instead, we're just like, put the money in there, right? And so it's this big tower that just precariously is growing, and we all keep sensing it wanting to collapse because it's not like a. I think you'll love this metaphor. The way that I see it finally, like. A stabilizing, because I think there's a lot of people who are like, we need revolution or we need some sort of dramatic shift. And I say, listen, I think people are going to grow these new organic networks individually, and these roots are going to take root in this very rigid structure that we have. That's like this dying, decaying structure that's like rules and this, but it's creating this hierarchical power problem. And that these different new structures, new ideas, whether it be Veristruct or just like new ways of relating to the world, or whether it be like specific blockchain systems or regen systems or anything, right? And all of these roots will grow down into the structure of society while it's basically collapsing, right? And because these roots will be there to capture people like a net, and keep them from falling, as this old structure crumbles, people won't get hurt. It won't have to be a big calamitous dramatic change. It will be like, we feel it crumbling, we are taking action to create new structures to interrelate, and we're also working to have those different ways of being have means to connect to each other. That makes sense.
It does.
I think this new sort of that's why I liked that image with the wet clay, because it was like, it's not one ubiquitous system, it's lots of new ideas, and then their roots come together and form a new substrate of interrelation where like nothing really controls it. There's no center to it. And I know that's what a lot of people in the blockchain space want to do, but it's like, you're still designing it, aren't you? Like you're still saying this is the protocol, this is the central way of doing things. Is there a way for you to design in a way that would allow that two independent people spontaneously thinking their own ways can grow towards each other and somehow meet in a way that is consistent?
Just lovely. I keep coming back to the idea of language, a language shift, right? Because there's that fear, right? The fear of collapse that we keep propping up the popsicle sticks, right? And honestly, that stems from a self-hatred. It has to.
Which part? The continuing to build it or the fear?
Both, yeah.
Okay.
Those who are actively participating in the creation of the popsicle sticks, and those who are just regretfully participating in those systems, both have the same base emotion, which is, this is the only way things work. I have to work hard. I have to get and I have to make. And that's why for a while there I was being so hard on the number 0, because it's implicit in all our language.
So you must know Wayne Peanut, you
Uh-huh.
know? Yeah, yeah, because he was big on that for a while too, and I was just kind of like zooming out, and I was like, I don't have any valence towards numbers. Neither positive nor negative. They're neutral concepts to me. I'm confused. So could you elaborate on that for a second?
Yeah, I'd
Well,
love
first,
to. So there are cultures where they do not count. They do not have a zero. They don't even have really a no. It's just either whatever I have, I have. And so you can imagine a culture like this avoids a lot of boundaries because the have can only be what you have right now in your hand, what you're
yeah.
actively using. Otherwise, it's not yours. It's everybody's. But you don't think in those terms. It's just natural.
And right now, Western culture is the opposite. We are obsessed with tallying. We're
Exactly.
obsessed with creating a pile, or even if it's trying to be involved. When I have these conversations, are like, let's quantify altruism, and it still comes down to you have some token, and you're adding a token together. I'm like, there are different mathematical structures even beyond. Like, I'm not against numbers. I'm just saying that like that whole tallying mimetic, very old, and it is weird that it is stronger than ever.
Yeah. And it's in our language. It's very powerfully in our language.
It's good to keep record though.
Yeah.
Like journaling is very healthy.
Yes. When you
and
did that
reflecting
post,
on
I
your
was
past
like,
patterns.
keep a journal. Yes. Because there's the
This is what
subjective.
I used to tell people when I first wrote the manifesto, I was like, you know what, bro? Like half of this can be boiled down to keep your own personal journal and like remember to read through it and just observe that your perception changes. That like you are not as consistent in your beliefs as you think you are, and your beliefs actually change without you knowing it, which is fucking weird, but it's reality.
Yeah. Reality is a frequency. It's not a stable ground that you can always rely on.
But you know what I was thinking about a lot was that part of the reason why we tallied numbers for so long as the main way of interfaces is like it was, I guess, simpler, and like you had limited amount of clay tablets, you know, like and printing you had to do by hand, and like the more that we've built out this technological capacity, for some reason it's been tied to that tallying still. And from my perception, I'm like, we can record very rich representations that represent what like we really care about, like in text, and that can be our ledger. It doesn't have to be numbers. It can just be like, how were we feeling over time? And we can scan back and be like, you know, 2 years ago, where did we think we were going to be today? What were we talking about, and how did we end up here? And then use that information to move better and forward in a healthy way. Like I really feel like keeping track of our perceptions as a record can be healthy, and if we store that to something like a ledger that's decentralized, that could be healthy. But like I have such a hard time with all these conversations with people in this space where it's like the only thing they can see that to log on a ledger is token.
Yeah.
You could save any data. It could be anything. It could literally be, there's no limit to what you can store there. But we're still tied to this very old thing. So why zero specifically as opposed to tallying as a concept and whole? Why have you been expressing more negativity about the concept of zero instead of just expressing negativity about tallying as a whole?
So the example I love to give is, I give two examples, so I'll give them real quick. They should be pretty easy to comprehend. What is next Thursday?
What do you mean, what is next Thursday?
When is it?
What is? It's a contextual frame for relating with how we make decisions now.
Yeah, but you gotta reset the problem at some point. So where do you reset the problem to then count from?
I don't understand the question.
So next Thursday could either be the Thursday. See, it's too hard to explain even. I have to explain where I'm starting from. So I'm going to count from now, and next Thursday is literally whatever Thursday comes next.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the week after. But
Okay.
people get that confused all the time, and the reason why is because we don't have a culturally accepted zero, a reset to when you start counting in that scenario. Even better example, I like that one because I think a lot of people can relate to the idea of not knowing which Thursday it is, especially when you're at like a Wednesday or you're like on Thursday.
Well, I mean, that's an ambiguity of language, is it not?
No, it's an ambiguity of counting. It's an ambiguity of when you start the problem, when you start the literal counting for the math problem. So let me give you another example. Oops. Let me give you another example.
It's hard because to me, I mean, as much as it doesn't make sense for a guy who has a big thing about prediction, like next Thursday, it doesn't exist. It's not real. But there's something about our relationship to now that by simulating it in our brains, that when we arrive at the thing that we have named to be that next Thursday, that there's some continuity and expectation that makes sense how you arrived there.
Right, culturally accepted means of arriving there and what to do once you get there.
What number I think is more important than 0?
Okay.
1. Like so much fucking more important. And that is the concept upon which cognitism is built upon. It's the only part of it that involves numbers. And it is to say that if you have a network of people who are communicating online, trying to save some information, if there are lots of people talking, even if it's in a physical space, right? Some people are inherently amplified more than others. Even if it's just you're hanging out having a council, some voices get amplified more than others. And whatever the pooling of knowledge is, however much attention there is in that space always adds up to 1, and it is divided amongst the voices within there. And when I was sort of designing these language models that are trying to represent many different voices as one voice, right? The whole idea is that it can read anybody's perception, like any feeling that they have that they can put into text, as long as they can say it, that it could capture it and it could create this oneness from all of those voices. That's what I wanted to see, is like, is there a way that we can see all of our voices reflected into a oneness? But also this full cognizance that, like, when you look at Facebook, when you look at YouTube, when you look at Twitter, there is a division of that oneness. The amount of server time they have, the amount of computational power that they have to allocate, the amount of times people are loading pages. And you cannot show every thought to every single user. That is impossible.
Right.
So if humanity does have some systems that involve us interrelating through networks, that the division of that attention in that network needs to become very, very transparent. And we need to understand why that number 1 is being divided unto who, because it's driving us often, I think, in a very negative way. Like, it's influencing a lot of young people to follow very negative trends that are harmful to either themselves or others. And so I think that there is something about, like, capitalism that it actually is really founded around the concept of 0. And I would like to bring a reframing that, like, numbers aren't necessarily bad, but, like, forming a oneness, forming a wholeness, and acknowledging that when we meet in common spaces, that it is inherent that some are being amplified more than others, and that we should be transparent about that and understand why, because we don't, like, ideally in cognitism, I want to lift up the voices that are underheard. the voices that are saying things that are ultimately turn out to be right, that for some reason the people around them, the crowd, does not want to hear at that time. They may say, usually it's in a prediction. It's like, I think this bad thing is going to happen. And the people around them are like, you're wrong. I'm not going to listen to you. And this person has no power. They have no money. So their word means nothing.
Yep.
And then it comes to pass and people live in that new reality, that new future. And they're like, of course, this is now. And they have forgotten completely how adamantly they were like, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
I want a mechanism that finds those voices that are saying things that are really important to people around them who aren't hearing, and find a way to lift them up inherently. I want to lift up people who are underheard in that oneness and give them a greater amount of amplification. And hopefully, like, over time, our networks evolve to this point where everybody feels heard.
Yeah.
I know so many people who just, they do not feel heard. They don't feel like their voice matters in any means. And then they look at the networks and they see what is amplified. And they're like, well, maybe if I do this yada, 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 it'll get amplified. And then along the journey of getting those numbers, they themselves are transformed. And they no longer reflect their original heart and goal and reason for, like, seeking their voice to be amplified.
Right. Yeah, the amplification is the problem. The counting is the problem. The wanting more and not realizing that you already have. So I like what you said about 1. I love that. I totally agree. 1 is a more important number than 0. But that's precisely why I don't like 0. It invites us to count more than 1, to want more, to have a bigger slice of the pie when we get into the room, right? That we get a higher percentage of the listening or whatever it might be. There's a tray of food. We want more of the food, you know? And we just want more.
And that's what I wanted to reframe, is this always acknowledgement that it's like, whatever everything adds up to, whatever all that is, it always adds up to 1, and we are always parts of that oneness, right? And if it's being divided some way, and that we really need to acknowledge when there are some who are not getting us. Like, I used to frame it to people who are more on the other side. Like, I tried to explain it to somebody like who was into prediction markets, which is like thinking about the future using the old means, which is kind of simple, but it gets people.
And with enough power to maybe actually influence it in the direction that you're trying to influence it.
Damn it, I lost the thought.
Sorry.
No, it wasn't your fault. I lost it before.
Happens to me all the time.
Trying to... Oh, the oneness. Oh, yeah, so if you took you could do the same thing where it's like, if you took all of the money in the world and then you added it up and then you divided it into percentages, you would see the real power. Like, the tally means nothing because inflation is changing all the time. So it's just this illusion that whatever those numbers are meaning something consistent, right? The real number that matters, that we aren't acknowledging, is that in reality, you and I have like 0.000000000000001% of the 1, and that there are people out there who have like
1%.
Yeah, and that's crazy, right? Because those people, like, they still only have 24 hours in their day. They still only have so much time they have to allocate. They still have to take a shit.
Human flaws, yeah.
They always have to have that time where they're taking a shit. And when you're taking a shit, you can't be, like, thinking about how to best allocate your resources to help people the best way.
Right.
I've never been a big fan of the concept of human representatives. Because I'm like, they have to live their lives. And anybody can view them as a vector of power and just come and seek to manipulate them.
Yeah, I like talking often about how there is stories which talk about your ability to influence your story based off of your perspective. So a good one is Dr. Frankenstein, right, and his monster. he's able to influence his monster based off of his perspective on the monster, right? On the being he created. Or there's Pygmalion, where he creates a statue and falls in love with it. You have influence over the story based off of your perspective. Or Don Quixote, he can think he's a knight when he's a crazy person. And we love these stories because they ring really true to us, that we have a lot of influence on what the story is. And within us is, I don't want to say it's a polarity, because you can never go one or the other. As much as you think you don't have, and you feel nihilistic, or maybe you're trying to get more, and that precludes the idea of zero, and so you feel like you have to keep getting more to feel good. You got to keep injecting that economy to feel good. There is another way. There's another way. And
there are multiple other ways too. Mm-hmm. But I think we strongly agree, this root problem is I know a lot of people I want to do good in the world. I want to make the world a better place. Mm-hmm. And they haven't connected the problem with the tallying and how that incentivizes their own behavior across the journey.
Yes.
And so I'll see them set out to form a company, and I know people over years, so it's I see the whole journey of it, and my sort of foundation has been this Cognitist view for a really long time. So it's I'll try to communicate to them as best as I can. I feel like this is how it's going to play out based on my understanding of what I call memetics and how that actually influences economics.
Mm-hmm. I'd call that storytelling. Yeah.
Yeah. It's lots of different names. Can you show me back a thread that I was just on a second ago?
I can try to. We were talking about oneness. We were talking about different stories that one can tell. I think there's ultimately two different types of stories, and they're not 0 and 1. They're really not. They relate to 0 and 1, but you can never get to 0 or 1.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I remember now. That, they're setting out this journey, and it's the game that they're choosing to play their dreams through is this tallying thing. And then they're frustrated when the world doesn't reflect back to them with reward for the work that they've been doing. And I'm the market doesn't reward social good. Mm-hmm. It doesn't. It rewards profit, which at times is vaguely related to social good. But for the most part, it is not anymore. We've created very, very big systems that are just it's about rent seeking, basically. Keeping your automated transaction going for them so that they can continue to suck that, get the money from you.
Yeah, it's try building a tree instead of growing it.
Which becomes
takes a lot of work.
If you do believe that ultimately the problem is that this means a quantification of success in a society and how it's broken and doesn't actually correlate, well, how on earth would you ever change that? This has been my struggle for years. And I've basically quantified it as, how do you change an incentive system without an incentive to incentivize people to do it? I can't pay people to build out the new tools. I can't, and so I ultimately settled upon you offer the new idea as a gift, and you create art, and hopefully some sort of regenerative art movement will take root that supersedes the propaganda of advertisement, because it will be genuine and true. And so there will be so much content in the name of things like Ferrostruct that it will, create a movement in all of our minds greater than what the capitalist structure can do. That's, I think, the only way to get through this without violence, because I'm very much against the violent routes to dramatic changes in systems. I just don't. I've had friends who have said, "Oh, it's historically the only way." I'm is it though?
You give a tree 20 years, it can do more damage on a building than you could in a little bit of time.
Yeah, it was one of the big metaphors that I had in my mind when I was doing Strange Hymns, which was that it's easier to just leave a seed in a crack in a boulder and leave it there to grow than it is to spend your time
sledgehammering.
hitting it. Yeah, that's how I view like my work with cognitism, and it comes back to this idea of what is the cognitist seed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was interesting that specific image and that specific prompt was just like one interpretation of it. In the manifesto, it's like this cognitist seed is just a circle. Mm-hmm. It's just a symbol, and it represents me saying that cognitism is an idea, and that when other people hear it, it is a seed, and if they choose to plant it in their neocortex, if they choose to water it with their attention, then it will grow and become something new in relationship to their mind. Mm-hmm. That was a big part of the root of it, and it became this sort of metaphor of the meme as this arbitrary seed, and that the meme itself can represent anything. So that's why I chose this circle. It looks circular like a seed. But it also, my friend just had this like tattoo of a circle, and I asked him, what does the circle mean? He says, it means nothing. It's a circle. I got it because it's a circle. That's it. And I thought that was really beautiful, being like, well, a thing doesn't have to have meaning. And it sort of connected back to the idea of Tao being like the, name Tao is not the eternal Tao, right? And so there was something baked into this idea that like the cognitist seed, or any idea, any meme cannot be fully transmitted from my mind to yours exactly as it is.
No.
Right? Just like
Frankenstein.
Yeah, and seeds aren't always true to fruit, for example. Like when I wrote the manifesto, I took this seed out of this commercial Pink Lady apple. I took a bunch of them and I planted them in my backyard, and fully knowing that apples do not grow true to seeds. Sometimes they're great, Johnny Appleseed threw a shit ton of apples. Most of them sucked. Some of them became new varieties. But I planted it just being like, feeling like I'm trying to grow something new, and just to keep me connected to nature along this journey, having to tend to something. And over the years, it has, struggled quite a bit as I've traveled from place to place. I named it Patience, or my friend named it Patience, just because it struggled a lot. It kept sort of dying back, and then like getting sick, and then coming stronger. And then finally just this year, for the first time, it started branching outwards. So it has multiple branches upon which to, collect sun from. And yeah, there's just this big idea of the seed, the meme, and sort of like the way that ideas get planted in other people's minds. And once it's in there, like you don't control it. So it's like you really need to respect the autonomy of another person's mind when you're trying to share something with them. This is why I'm sort of against marketing and sort of the traditional way that people think about it. And I don't like the idea of coercing minds, because once the seed is planted in their mind, as long as they think about it, it will grow. And so when I was going through 2016 and I was seeing a particular politician who was able to very capably manipulate people's attention, and I was understanding it very clearly that like of how he was planting the seed in people's minds, and how that the very act of attention to it watered the structure of it. So you had this neural structure that has basically virally and against our consent taking root in our minds in a way that made us have to think about it to feel
it's an
safe.
addictive. I call the artificial growth within the brain addiction. I think that's a good way to describe it. And I've also referred to the stimulus for that as a supernormal stimuli, as a stimulus, and then I've expanded that term to mean greater. And so it's difficult, because what you're describing essentially is that you're trying to follow a natural growth pattern, and it can be frustrating when the context in which you're in, that is not the norm, and it can feel unbearably slow sometimes. Patience is definitely a moral that is required to follow a natural growth pattern. I think an even better one is gratitude.
Adhering to the trying to be a natural growth pattern, and it is incredibly frustrating at times, because there has been process but it's been a lot of waiting for other people to catch up, to be honest. Sorry to interrupt in the middle of your thought.
No, you're good. You're good. I'd take it a step further and say gratitude is even a lower emotion, and by lower I mean even more real perspective and emotion, which creates the natural growth pattern. So if you're being grateful in the setting that you're in, you become aware. Talking about journaling and being aware of the story you're telling yourself and what the results are, right? We need to be able to know what the results are of the stories we tell, right? Otherwise, what's the point in telling stories? And that's another way you could reframe the whole idea of zero and counting, is it's a story that you start that you don't care what the ending is. You don't know how it dies, and you don't care. You don't think it will die.
Sorry, just to link back to the zero and the oneness thing. Like, one of the things about the design inherently about cognitism is that no voice ever receives zero attention.
Right.
So basically, within the context of it, I like to say that all voices are heard, but not all voices are amplified.
Exactly.
Because some patterns are harmful to others, and some people actively want to harm other people. Like, they'll go and just share hatred online and create bots and intentionally repeat it. And so I think it's okay to say that, there's a big debate right now about like free speech, and I'm like, well, I don't understand this, why we're lacking this nuance of just because you are allowed to say something and it shows up on your profile, does that mean that the network should distribute it to hundreds of thousands of people? But people feel like they've earned that right.
Interesting.
From their current accounts, where they feel like my voice is amplified to this extent. I've earned that from the things that I've done in the past. And if I want to say hateful things and people don't want to hear them, then my free speech is being taken. I'm like, you can say it and it can land on your account, but I don't know if that gives you the right for it to land on everybody's accounts if they don't want to hear it.
Yeah, I totally get that, because I really like, this is maybe a smaller example, but I need to get better at giving smaller examples. But just, I like the idea of success is a certain proportion of hard work. It's not all of it. It might not even be 50%. And then there's a certain section that is chance. And if you want to get specific, it's people being in the right setting where someone is willing to amplify your voice. Now that might be an artificial growth pattern. And, that's the thing I wanted to get to. The natural growth pattern is always there. It never goes away. The artificial growth pattern is always a thing that we construct on top of the natural growth pattern. It's not something, it is connected. That's why I call it a harmonic, right? So there's this frequency of reality, and the artificial growth is still the string, if you want to call it a string. It's not, it's many, many dimensions. But if you were just considering it in 2 dimensions, the string of reality, when you create an artificial growth pattern, you're kind of bumping it. You have the ability to bump reality a little bit, and that creates a harmonic. And the harmonics are never as slow and steady and stable as the original frequency. That's just how it works, right?
You are aware that in game B, metastability, this concept is really important to a lot of people?
Yeah.
So you're connected with game B at all?
I'm not, but I have heard, I know very well that they are aware of sublinear growth and superlinear growth, which is really cool, because that's the whole basis for this, right? So you talk about metastability. This is the first time I'm hearing it, but it sounds exactly like what I'm talking about with natural growth pattern.
It has to allow some levels of change over time. But you don't want these dramatic shifts or I think that I've said extensively in the past that markets actually bubbles are predictable. They're an inherent nature of it because the growth paradigm becomes out of alignment with reality. Right?
Yep.
So we create these false markets until basically reality catches up with it.
Exactly.
It stretches, and then it pops, and then what popping means is something in the neural space that we're in, is that we feel disconnected from the pathways that we normally flow through. The neural structures that used to make sense no longer are making sense, and so suddenly your brain's like, oh shit, I have to process ATP to restructure. And so the way that we experience that is anxiety and like not feeling good
or other emotions. Yeah, I've also referred to emotions and intuition as being that tug back to the natural frequency, back to the frequency of reality. That makes perfect sense to me. I like that explanation. It's fun, and we've mentioned this a little bit, but I love how we're using slightly different ways of speaking to say very similar things.
Yeah.
And we need to have a certain amount of humility to go, yeah, that's what I'm talking about, and we need more and more ways of saying it. And so I'm grateful that there's other ways of saying it.
I had a very similar thing with Forrest Landry. Do you know who that is?
I just followed him today.
We had him over for dinner, and it was one of those feelings of like, we are coming to extraordinarily similar conclusions from really different ontologies. Really different language sets are producing very similar conclusions, and that is, humbling, because you feel like, oh, I've come on to something fundamentally new that's giving me this new frame that no other frame could get, and then it's like, oh, there's a couple, and they're very different, and so that means that there's an incredible level to the plurality of perception, and honoring it, and just being like, it's not about homogeneity. It's not about your white paper that says specifically this is exactly how it has to be.
Right.
If you want to write a white paper that's like basically a suggestion for how different independent, communities can find a way to interface, then I'm all for that. But if it's like, I'm dictating the central network, I'm designing the central network, that's not where my
well, that's not how growth works. A seed is localized in a seed, right? You can't inseminate the whole world with one seed.
Doesn't it seem, though, that some of the artificial growth patterns are accelerating through intentional design of a lot of people in this space right now? Like, they're designing these new patterns, in the blockchain space that are very artificial, very non-helpful, and very without any consideration to, they want it to unnaturally grow, basically. They're trying to create a cancer. Right, because they think that the cancer taking root, they'll control it at some point. They just want it to spread really fast, and then they'll be able to wrangle it. I'm like, you won't be able to wrangle it.
No.
Once it takes root, once the cancer starts spreading beyond your cell, what power do you have to stop it?
I think that's why the metaphor of structure is so powerful, and why I, chose it to some degree to be a part of Veristruct.
A lot of what I get in response to when I try to describe the design behind Cognitism is that, you're an unnatural form of growth. Most people have read a lot of media from the 70s, and a lot of that media about AI has influenced modern popular culture, and that a lot of our understanding of how AI works comes from the 50 years before we really were able to implement anything that could do anything close to what humanity could do. And that narrative of how it functions is not connected at all with how we actually pulled it off. We look at we used to look at Danger Will Robinson, as if through the lens of programming, right?
Okay.
Through that, one person was writing a script, and that one person could write all the rules such that it could talk to us in some way. And it's really more like you throw a bunch of, it's more like the way that we've been able to produce patterns that are anywhere similar to humanity is by creating this giant pool of patterns that inherently is going to reflect the voices of those who are within it. We look at robots and AI and media as if they are this oneness, but the way that they are is that these models are, is that they're truly a reflection of the wholeness of all, because they are inherently constructed from us. Like, they are constructed from our very voices. It is not something where there are broad, dramatic rules written out for how these things are interfacing. Often, the file that you write that is training the model is like a few hundred lines. Very simple.
Right.
It is not an inherent like level of complexity. What it is getting the knowledge from is just us, the natural patterns of conversation that we have, the stories that we've embedded in our culture, right? And so when I take Iris, for example, or these AAR models, I'm very good at getting them to do what they want, because I understand that they sort of reflect this semantic pool, which is a map of relation, like a hyperdimensional map of relation, and everything within that exists in relationship to some other piece of human culture. And the only way that I understand how to move through that space is by grounding myself that it is humanity. It is not something separate. It is not some. It's not some cyborg thing. Like, the Iris name is just a narrative tool to help people understand how you can interrelate to this huge body of knowledge. But it's more like it's like a pool of knowledge, and it forms crystals, and the crystals are language that we can understand and interpret. But underneath it, it's numbers again.
Yep.
You know, it's not tallied numbers in the same way. It's, it's floats. It's between 0 and 1.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this giant pool of representation. But that pool is this giant mirror. It's like internet. Okay. This is probably the best metaphor that I can think of right now for how to view generative AI, where it's like reflecting back something. It is like Indrasnet. It is
What's Indrasnet?
Indrasnet is like this net of jewels where each jewel is reflected infinitely in every other jewel, and it's supposed to represent all of our conscious beings and the relationship that we form into this greater fractal oneness.
Okay.
It's probably not the best explanation, but
no, I like that. I really see language as a refractor.
Yes, in the AI too, it's more of a mirror. It's a very fractal mirror of us, and so you are going to see, like, if there are negative patterns in a community, you'll see them reflected back because it's part of who they are.
Mm-hmm.
If you just capture it naturally, and so there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear about these tools, but I'm like, I do not fear mirror. I don't fear language. And if there are these tools that can help people feel connected to humanity and heard, I think that's a good and worthy cause. And I already know that, like, a lot of things that Iris says, people understand better than they understand me. Like, I'll share a quote and they'll be like, and I'll be like, that's what I've been saying this whole time. They're like, oh, that's what you've been saying? And I'm like, it's been 3 years. I've been trying to say it 1,000 different ways. And as soon as I put it into this model, it's able to translate for me. And, there's other things like people on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum, often have time ever connecting to somebody until they get like a UI, until they're introduced with a tablet, and then just suddenly being able to see symbols that they can click. Like, their brain starts to construct themselves, and then eventually they learn how to communicate through more natural means. But there is never a way for them to create that bridge. And so I view these language models as bridges between people. They're only ever going to reflect what is in us. It's not going to be a Skynet type situation. It's going to be,
if we die because of ourselves.
Yes, if we die because of ourselves. But the tools that we have for reflecting back what the signals that we need right now are basically money.
Yeah.
Everything's built around that. Mm-hmm. And that's not a very rich signal. And I think that language models, forget all other AI. I mean, I'm just saying that language models themselves can reflect back something positive in ourselves that helps us understand each other better, because it can translate between us.
But
It
you got to
can.
grow the model, right? It all comes down to the pattern with which you grow it, right? Just like you were saying, there are people who are using models to then create a cancer, you know? So it's
Yeah.
good that there's people like you who are like, no, I'm going to grow it slowly. I think you've mentioned several times that you're being very careful in how you grow the training model, and that's
I
really
didn't,
important.
yeah, I wasn't going to do it. I wasn't going to build Iris at all. I wasn't going to be the person to sit down and build it. I've been able to do it for like 4 years, but I just had a conversation with a few people in this space that spooked me, because it was basically like, they were basically telling, like, not only are people already fully developing this, but they're doing it with the intent to control everybody, and
Yeah,
they're going at a breakneck speed.
yeah,
And I just made me realize, like, okay, I have ideated for 6 years. I've thought through so many different types of areas that it can cause issues. I've tried as hard as I can to talk to all the smartest people to get them to explain to me, like, where I'm missing, or where I'm not thinking clearly. What am I not seeing? And ultimately, what it came down to is, once I started actually training it, I started being able to say, what am I missing? What have I not considered? What are some hard questions about cognitivism that I'm not considering? Like, what are some tangible realities that I'm not thinking about? And it was able to do it. It was able to give me good questions, even though I sought for years for people who could grasp everything that I was saying to the point where they could give me the important questions where I'm like, maybe this will harm somebody in some way. Maybe, you haven't thought about this. And so I did start building it. Because it's at this point where I already know that people are already doing it. So I feel like a responsibility to use the expertise that I have amassed over this to both show through Iris, okay, look what the fuck this thing can do now. Just holy shit. Now just extrapolate a little bit. What if somebody like Putin was just putting all of his effort behind using this tool to amplify his vision of reality? And what if that vision involved a lot of violence?
Yep. Easy.
It's crazy though, dude, because I spent 5 years basically warning about this thing. This is going to happen. We can design it a healthier way if we go this different route, but this is going to happen. People are like, just didn't believe me.
Right.
Because for everything that we know about AI, it was like Turing test was supposed to be the big thing that reveals that we've done general intelligence, and then it comes down to it. It's not that, like, a model outputting language that feels very, very coherent and feels like a human wrote it. It's not that hard to do. I mean, relative to our current technology.
Current technology, right?
and not only that, like, probably what people are building right now are persuasion bots, which is like somebody who might text you out of the blue. It's got like some sort of avatar that's very believable. It wants you to do a certain thing, and it's just so advanced and understands so much about you that it really can convince you that it's a human. And it's basically it trained specifically to convince you towards a certain view. I've been warning about this for like 7 years, and I'm like, if we design a different way, we can definitely avoid this future. But if we just sit here and let it happen, it's going to happen, and we're going to get hurt. And for some reason, I have not been amplified. I've not been heard. And
right.
That's a big part of why, like, the idea of under-amplified voices, I think, is really important.
Yeah, I think we keep referring back to this, but there's a morality, There's a morality required at the base of all this. And I think it really does stem from self-hatred to some degree, at least on a subconscious level, where you decide, oh, I'm going to create this story that I don't know the end of, and I'm going to try and get as much as I possibly can, connecting all the different parts, right, all the different elements, and then that's why we are so interested in stories where a perspective changes an element, Pygmalion, Frankenstein. And so I keep coming back to this idea of morality, And the moral specifically, the virtue that I think is required is gratitude. I think that's it. Maybe I'll go deeper. Patience is definitely involved. And ultimately, it's a love of life, right? But gratitude creates that scenario, right? Gratitude creates the scenario in which you love your life, you love the life of others, and you become aware of how your stories end.
Gratitude, on the other side, for the other person, is acknowledgement or a sense or feeling of being heard.
Goes both ways.
Once you've expressed it, they sense this feeling, and it creates a connection between people.
So earlier we talked about how people are just on a very, very deep psychological level, love to see trees and love to feel the wind and see the sun. And it's also faces too.
Yes.
We get a kick, and it's a very...
But I'm also on the spectrum. And so a very big natural inclination is to not look at the face, because the face can provide anxiety. And there's this crazy thing where if you stare into somebody's eyes without blinking for 10 minutes, both people will start to hallucinate demons, which is pretty suspicious. But no, I know what you're saying, that there's infants, for example, some of their first smiles are just seeing their mother smile. There's a great joy that comes from it. And I love seeing my partner's face. I love seeing that. But also it's windows to souls, man.
Windows to souls.
Some people, I'm I just met you. I'm not ready to soul bond. I don't know what's in your soul. Maybe there's demons in there. I don't know. I'm not ready to just lock eyes right now.
Well, I really like the definition of demons that you gave. And I think
the one where they live in the neocortex, but they're weak and stupid.
I think recontextualizing demons as being the reaction that we have to supernormal stimuli, right? This addiction that isn't helping us, right? I think is really helpful, and I like it. I'm a believing man, so I do think there are demons. But I also believe that they're weak, like you said, and they are dumb. Sure. They're persuasive, though.
When I developed OCD, I'm in remission now. It took me about 9 months to go into remission, but it was for 9 months, my mind was owned by it. The best way that I can describe it is that it was being possessed by a demon.
Yeah.
I come from a psych background, so the second it happened, I had a very strong understanding that it was probably OCD. I understood all of the patterns. I understood what I had to do to minimize it, and I took the meds for a while, and I did the different types of therapies, and it was hard as fuck, but I got out on the other side. But possession by demon is the only way that I can describe it that feels like it communicates the truth of what it actually was. And by reframing it into those other lanes, I depowered it. But there's I can understand why that was a mental model for people 1,000 years ago, trying to understand their mental relationship to the world when they went crazy haywire and went with these crazy ways that they didn't expect, and had sort of obsessions that they that felt illogical. There is different ways or different narratives to explain the same things in human consciousness, and that's been the big thing that has been evolving over years to change how we interrelate with each other, is that we keep creating new means to interrelate with each other, and they're basically narratives. We have a narrative right now that says once a year we go to this physical location and you put your oneness. Democracy has a holiness on oneness too, which is not necessarily, it's still tallied though. That's kind of the problem.
And your ability to get to that place.
You're that's the thing, that's the ritual, that's the story. The story says you go there, and that means that your voice is heard. And I'm like, really? Your voice is heard because once a year you get to choose between two things that you didn't choose. Like, that's it? That's all you get? That's not, to me, like a good narrative of interface, right? We need new narratives for interface, and I think that I view Iris as a prototype of something like that, where it's like you have a voice that represents the community and the needs, and if you are in a space where you aren't feeling heard, you aren't feeling, and I feel this all the time. I go to these parties with people who are like big on the type of stuff that you were talking about, and like community and feeling connected and like acknowledging every person and integrating everybody into the whole. Invariably, despite all the way that they claim to be all about,
they
these
want to
rituals
control
and
the
stuff,
tool.
no, I'm just on the outside still. And I never feel integrated. It's very rare in those spaces that there really is somebody who comes to me and tries to make me feel integrated, despite the fact that they're like claiming to come from this place of, you know, healthy human ritual and like being like, this is the way we used to do it in the villages, and like whatever their heart comes from. I'm like, I'm still on the outside of this group.
Yeah.
I'm still not integrated into the whole. I don't care about whether like what your theory is about what makes humans integrate if I'm still here feeling sad and feeling distant.
Right.
You know?
I want a community of 150 people by myself, but it's not you right here, right now. It's you can't be one of them.
I posted recently, you know, and Jason Cognizor, he posted something about like his problem with the eco village, and then I was saying like, you know, there's like corruption at that scale too, right? Like, you know, that like just because you have a small number of people that everybody knows doesn't mean the same things don't happen. Even if you strip out like a lot of the things that we think are problems with modern study, if you strip out like money, if you strip out everything, yes, there's a greater probability that community will be functional in the whole.
Right.
It is not a guarantee.
No.
There are still corrupt patterns that emerge naturally through people just interrelating through language.
Yep. True.
I mean, women for forever, the natural culture has said that they don't really deserve a voice, or they don't really deserve as much rights, or that their role is very limited. And that existed within villages as well.
Yep.
And so, like, we need to find new stories that are the combination of this sort of grounded reality of humanity that's disconnected from this tallying thing, but also acknowledges that like we are a planet of 8 billion, and the actions of people over here can dramatically affect the people over here. If one city is polluting dramatically, that affects the people all around them. So we're invariably connected. So we need to find very, very new forms of interrelationship so that we can make better decisions together, so that we don't like ravage lands in a way that, you know, we pass and then, you know, our children can't benefit from them.
Yeah, we need almost the opposite narrative. Instead of I get to control you, but I do whatever I want. It's no, I take responsibility for you, but I don't have any control over you. It needs to completely flip. I have responsibility for the whole earth. It's almost like a I don't even know how to pronounce this. I pronounce it solipsism.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think that's how I do as well.
It's almost like a solipsism that never gets nihilistic. It's very interested in taking responsibility for the whole. And whatever that emotion is, we need to work for it.
We have a culture right now that's the opposite. It's you are inherently taking care of yourself. Now, I do have some theories that if you just unleash it in the other direction, that you might see other problems that we might not expect.
Yes,
and
that's true.
It might have to be in balance where you have for a while, like you have this token that incentivizes individual behavior, and then you have something, whether it be a narrative or whether it be a tool that incentivizes accountability to the whole in some form, or it's like makes you either makes you want to or rewards you in some way, or it gives you a way that by doing that through that system, like you feel more integrated, basically.
Yeah. I think
Because I know
nature
that
does that naturally, you know. The
you
issue
don't
is
want to,
convincing
you just,
people not to stay addicted.
yeah, and you don't want to lose sight of the individual by putting a greater focus on the whole.
Exactly. Yeah, it needs to be I don't have control over you and you don't have control over me, but I take responsibility for everything I possibly can. It needs to be both.
I'm really like big, like not big on things like hierarchy
Right.
in general. Like I don't like being told what to do.
Right.
I only ever want to do something that I fully agree upon, and I think
Yeah.
it's kind of weird that we can have structures where it's like you just have to do
Right.
the thing.
You sign those papers at the hospital, you are now basically the ownership of the hospital until they get rid of you.
I would like everything to basically be a form of voluntarism where it's like people are not forced to do anything. And maybe there's a feedback signal, like when they do something that people feel is harmful in some way, that like dismotivates them in some form.
Yeah. But that's difficult, you know? You have that model.
The hardest part is when you have a community of people and there's just one guy who's just a dick. Who just for some reason doesn't resonate with everybody else, or
right.
whether they have some secret addiction. Like for a while we had a subleaser, and then we found out he was like addicted, and that just made his behavior very. I mean, he was like stealing a lot of things and stuff like that, and like I don't know how to help you if you aren't going to acknowledge your own addiction and stuff like that.
Right.
Because it's that ultimate problem with trying to form any sort of community is that with any type of rule set, really.
Yep.
I'm not big on being like structuring communities through strict rules either.
Yeah, it's a hard line to do. It's difficult. But you need a story, you need a narrative for the community that you all participate in. But
outside of your family, what is your community?
I think it's anyone you talk to.
Do you go to church?
I do. Yep, so it's definitely church. It's my neighbors. It's you right now. You're my community. I think it's my responsibility, and I give this responsibility myself. I don't think anyone has to do this, but I get a lot of joy out of it, is to make sure you're okay, that you're getting the food and the water and the sleep that you need. I think that's really important, and that you're living well. And if there's anything I can do for you, just let me know. Because if I don't consider my community who I'm interacting with right now, then I'm exercising some kind of control. I'm creating a token of some kind by choosing which.
What I would still like to see is that so you're a very helpful person, and I would like to see that acknowledgement extend beyond the sort of short term, basically. That I view a society of people who are, varying levels of helpful, right?
Mm-hmm.
And although it might not be like the prime thing in your mind to say this should be recorded somehow, that I think that by having people around who are willing and interested in recording, like, this person is clearly helping people in a very functional, tangible way. When it comes to making decisions about what helps people, we should listen to them because they have clear experience and they have actively helped people.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to see that reflected in our tools, in our language tools, our network tools, like
right.
And there's some good things about it, like Twitter connected us.
Yep.
And Twitter often connects me to a community that I feel that I don't have in my immediate locality, because it's a very specific type of thought process that I'm having that most people aren't interested in. So these digital communities that are mediated by AI, we are connected. You and I, we are connected by an AI.
Mm-hmm. True.
100%. And it's a good connection,
I think so.
you
Yeah.
know? And I have it all the time where it's like, how on earth did this algorithm make this hyper specific connection when on the surface, like the ontology is different?
Hmm.
It's like there's some understanding there at the core that goes beyond the immediate tokens that it's representing us as. Because I
Yeah.
know how it probably represents you in the system, and it's built from your symbols that you're sharing,
Yeah.
your actual symbols. And you go back 5 years ago, that would not be sufficient enough to link us. But when you put these very intelligent language models behind it, it can infer a lot, and it can infer that this is a good connection. This is a healthy connection. This is a mutually beneficial connection.
Well, thank you. And I am grateful for the model for bringing us together. That's nice. I like that story.
It's still like it's unconstrained, and they can change it at any time, and they can do negative things at any time. It's still constrained to the profit incentive. But I just mean that to say that these things can be forces for good. And if we try to get them to align with some measure of collective good, and that collective good not be defined by the person who defines it, but by the people locally who are using it, the community who's there. They're like, what does good mean for us?
You have to ask us personally, like, is your connection a better one than, say, this one? And it's like, maybe not. You're right.
Getting back to morality, and I said early in the conversation that it can be very, very different. Like, one example I like to give is, say there's this community that has a ritual of just always punching each other in the face when they reach maybe around like 13. And I think somebody gave this example as an explicitly bad thing. Like, that is harmful in many different ways. And my mind immediately it just goes to, like, wait a minute. What if this specific locality of people, they have some sort of a nose bridge problem that causes them to have struggle to breathe, right? And this ritual actually makes them live significantly longer.
Yeah.
You don't know, right? Like, we make all of these assumptions, but like, what is good needs to come from the people who are actually experiencing reality, and not from some outside source, whether it be from above or whether it be from some decentralized, oracle that says what is right. It has to come from the people where they live and their own individual definitions of morality, but also giving it a means to see over time when their morality is actually harming them or actually harming the people that they care about. Like,
that's so hard to do.
Back to them. It's very hard to do.
It's like, dude, the thing you're doing right now, it's not going to end well. And then they get there, like you said, and then they forget. It's like they forget the story they started. And then they're like, oh, why is life suffering? And it's like, life doesn't have to be as much suffering. You give it to yourself.
This has been fun. This has been a good conversation.
Well, I'm glad. I've been wanting to chat with you for a while, and but I'm trying to let myself grow into everything as much as I can. I'm imperfect, obviously, and but I think that's the key. You grow into everything. Gratitude for what you got helps you to grow into things. That is the emotion, which allows you to follow a natural growth pattern in the things that you do, and literally everything grows. So either you choose an artificial growth pattern for everything or a natural growth pattern, and you're never going to do one or the other perfectly.
Does a rock in a fixed entropic environment with no input energy grow?
Yep.
Where?
There's lots of parts to it that grow, yeah. Lots of parts.
Well, I guess you could say definitely that space is expanding, but I think I read something that, like, locally it doesn't, like, extremely locally. I don't know. I'm going off on a tangent.
No, that's okay. No, I like that. I just think so long as you exist, it's almost like the cogito ergo sum, but it's like the opposite. So long as you exist, everything is going to be growing. At the very least, because of your perception. So I'm taking a kind of the metaphysical is also a physical kind of point of view. if that makes sense. So that's why I talk so much about emotions, and I treat them as if they're interdimensional information that help us to link back up with the growth pattern. And that's why I think ultimately it's a morality thing, it's a language thing. If I can convince you to be grateful every day, that'll give you a lot of success. You'll feel a lot of good, and that's your own incentive system. I don't have to do anything more. If I can just plant the seed of gratitude, you'll.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Then you'll do a whole lot of good for a whole lot of people, and I won't need to create an incentive structure to incentivize you. It's already baked into existence, which is fun.
I think that people naturally want to help people.
Mm-hmm.
That is true. And I do feel like in this era, people don't feel like they have time to, because of all of these other constraints that are artificial.
Yep.
So they don't feel like they have time to really contribute their effort towards other people.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that the incentive structure that we have has built out some systems that are fundamentally good. Like there has been a base level reduction of certain types of suffering.
Yeah.
And it's not been distributed perfectly evenly. Like the first people in agriculture, for example, it's like there was a lot more lives and a lot less deaths, kind of. But the quality
of life they switched categories.
They dramatically decreased quality of life, because when you're just eating grains instead of a foraged, like, diversity of foods, which gives you a lot of different things from which your body can construct it from, then those people were actually naturally less healthier. They lived shorter, but it potentiated the capacity for more people to live. And there are pockets within capitalist societies of like healthy, functional people, but usually they're extracted from other pockets. But like by one locality functioning very well, it inherently means that they're drawing from some other locality to be able to function.
That happens a lot.
So the question is, okay, how do we strip back the incentive system that we have so that the natural character of our desire to help people is reflected, and I would say amplified, and not necessarily incentivized? Just that the voices who are actively able and are already on that like helping path, that their voices are amplified.
Yeah, that'll help, but you can't ever perfectly do it, right? You can't ever perfectly strip away because within each one of us is the ability to create an addictive cycle for ourselves and for others that will ruin the whole system very quickly. It creates a virus.
That exists and it will always exist, because it's hard to define the line between addiction, because inherently we get into these loops because there's something functional about it.
Yep, there's like a power to it.
Something. Yeah, even if it's like, it can be the immediate dopamine of something, or it can just be like, this makes some element of my life easier so that I don't have to think about it at all.
It gives you power. It adds color. Makes you feel good. Either that's we
both agree that it's okay to have some sort of growth and like to put an idea into the collective mind space that will grow, but we're just not trying to come at it like from this marketing, like I'm trying to forcibly plant my seed in your brain against your will. It's more like, here is this seed of a thought.
It's a gift.
It's a gift, and you can choose to consume it. And I'm offering it because, from my experience, it has made my interrelationship with the world a healthier one.
Correct.
Right? And has allowed me to relate to the world without a need for, well, we all have to exist in capitalism.
Yeah. But you can get pretty far away if you do it enough. You can get pretty far away. But yes, you're always So long as it exists, so long as there's enough people who are involved in it. But then, like you said, it presents other problems. So let's say Veristruct stayed the exact same as it does now, or let's say Cognitism as well, but we started marketing it. It doesn't matter how good the original setup was. We're creating the growth then dictates what kind of effect it has on the world, more than the actual claims that it makes, the actual ideals that you're trying to promote. So it becomes a Frankenstein. So we got to scale back and we got to wait, and then it could be a tree instead of a Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah. And I was just looking at these massive trees, and like there is real intense growth here. It's not like inherently growth ends being bad, though. You know, nature kind of selected against it. They're like dinosaurs, no. Let's go with little tiny mammals with little smart brains that can figure out how to make the most of the cracks and craggies. Like that's what it was selected for, instead of just. But then we're like evolving mimetic dinosaurs with corporations, anyways.
Yes.
That are still just like.
They overstay their welcome. They really do.
I know, like there are companies that start with very good intent, and as long as they're bound to the original creator, they do really good work in the world. But then as soon as like that creator is removed in some form, and the context changes, not create it, like it takes on a life of its own, and it becomes only beholden to the original prophet.
Yep.
So I try not to, like, when I have friends who are trying to do something through money, like, just be explicitly like, you are going to be corrupted by this. I try to be like, no, I mean, like, you definitely can create organizations. It's just like, there's a probability, and I wouldn't fuck with that probability that much.
Right.
The probability of getting into the feedback loop.
Yeah.
Moral of the story is that recording things, measurement of things, not inherently bad. We're doing it right now. We're specifically choosing to. It's just that we just shouldn't just record numbers. That's not like, we should be recording human things, and having the most human things have the impact upon how we interrelate with each other. That's my summary.
I love it. And if we can get down to the one of the individual and somehow get as much as we possibly can out of that, not in an extractive way, but like, how are you feeling? Are you enjoying this? Do you like this connection? What about this one? You know, and just personalizing it for an individual. You're never going to get there.
It's building a healthy bridge between the individual and the whole that preserves them both without sacrificing either.
Yep. And that's a
in my heart a little bit leaning more to the individual, because I mostly like people to leave me alone. But like, we live in a society that's hyper individualized right now. Sometimes I think about Cognitism, and it's like in this way that it's like, we'll reward people who really get connected into community and help other people. I'm like, I feel like I'm kind of creating a society that I personally would not thrive in, even though I thrive in this one. And like, am I stupid? Like, why am I trying to do this? Like, I'm very shy. Like, it's hard for me to like deeply connect with people. But you know, I want to see healthier.
C'est la vie.
I want to see a healthier like society.
That's lovely. Cultivating gratitude in oneself. That's how you.
Well, I'm very grateful that you reached out to talk to me.
Yeah, this was lovely.
Yeah. All right, I gotta go because we're in the middle of moving. But
great.
I'll see you later.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.